The first thing she said when I walked in was, "Behave." Just that, a teasing little jab, like she already knew I wouldn't. I froze for a split second, caught between embarrassment and something else I couldn't quite name. Her sister was leaning against the counter, smirking like she'd been waiting for the exact moment to see me stumble. I shouldn't have been here, really. The bookstore smelled faintly of paper glue and lemon polish, the sort of scent that lingers in the back of your throat. I was supposed to be stocking the new arrivals, filing receipts, maybe pretending I knew more about fiction than I actually did. Instead, I kept catching glimpses of her across the shop, the older woman who managed this corner of the city like she owned it without ever needing to say it. She wasn't just confident. She was luminous, but not in a way that demanded attention. More like she moved through the air and everything bent around her weight. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands curling around her jawline, and I swear I noticed the way her hands lingered on the edges of the counter, brushing against worn wood, like she measured her movements even in stillness. And then her eyes, sharp, warm, impossible to look away from, flicked toward me again. That tiny flash of acknowledgement, a pause long enough to make my stomach tighten, even though we'd barely exchanged words. I was 24, fumbling with boxes of novels I'd barely heard of, and she was her. Experienced. Steady. A woman who seemed to know herself inside and out, who carried a quiet authority even while laughing at some ridiculous joke her sister made. I watched the way she tilted her head just slightly when she caught me staring, as if she were both amused and mildly exasperated. And then she said nothing. Nothing at all. Just smiled. And my chest got tight in a way I wasn't ready to admit to myself. The shop was almost empty, except for the soft hum of the radiator and the quiet shuffle of pages. I stepped closer to put a stack of books on the counter, accidentally brushing against hers. My fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at me, tilted her chin, and gave that same faint smile. My brain short-circuited. "Need a hand?" she asked, her voice calm, even like she could have been talking about moving boxes or about the weather. But I knew. There was a subtle electricity in the air, the kind that makes your hands sweat and your throat dry at the same time. I tried to answer. Words failed, so I nodded instead, gripping the edges of the box like it was a lifeline. Her sister snorted softly, clearly enjoying my discomfort, and I caught the briefest glance between the two women. A silent, conspiratorial glance that somehow included me in their private little world, whether I wanted to be included or not. There was a pause then. A moment stretched thin, filled only with the faint rustle of paper and the smell of old ink. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that maybe it was just the angle of her head or the way sunlight hit her cheek. But I couldn't stop noticing the subtle tension, the way her gaze seemed to settle somewhere behind me, or maybe through me, before she returned to whatever task she'd been doing. I stacked the last of the novels and stepped back, pretending to straighten my shirt, pretending not to be aware of her presence like it mattered. But even as I walked to the other side of the counter, I could still feel it, the small, electric pulse of something unspoken. And as I caught her eyes again for just a second, that faint, almost mischievous smile lingered in my mind long after she turned away. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. And yet there she was, crouched behind the counter, muttering curses at a jammed cash register. The fluorescent lights flickered above us, buzzing faintly, filling the silence between her soft exhalations of frustration. "Need a hand?" I asked, stepping closer. My voice sounded clumsy even to me, like a bad imitation of confidence. She straightened abruptly, brushing her hands on her jeans, and gave me a quick, almost sharp glance. "I've got it," she said, her tone clipped, professional, but not unkind. Still, there was a flicker in her eyes, fatigue, maybe, or something else I couldn't name, that made my chest tighten. I knelt beside her anyway, fumbling with the small mechanics of the register. She didn't say much, but I noticed everything. The way her fingers flexed over the keys, how her nails caught the dim light, the faint crease between her brows, how her breath hitched ever so slightly when something didn't fit. I hate when these things act up, she muttered finally, almost to herself. There was a softness in her voice, a vulnerability that felt entirely uncharacteristic of the woman who walked into a room like she already owned it. I wanted to reach out, but I froze, not wanting to overstep. Instead, I just handed her a tiny screwdriver. Thanks, she said quietly. Our fingers brushed, just briefly, but enough for a current to flicker between us. She glanced up at me, and for a second, her lips parted, as if she wanted to say more but couldn't. I watched her laugh then, soft and slightly breathless, at some joke her sister whispered from the counter. It wasn't forced. It didn't fill the room the way some laughs do. It was private, almost secret, like a fragment of herself she only let out in the rarest moments. I felt like I was intruding, but I didn't want her to stop. She leaned back on her heels, exhaling, and I noticed the faint shadows under her eyes. Long hours, maybe. Responsibilities she carried alone. And yet, even in that brief moment of weakness, there was a dignity in the way she held herself. She wasn't asking for help, but she let it happen anyway. Almost, I said, twisting the screwdriver one last time. The register clicked open. She exhaled again, a sound somewhere between relief and surprise. She looked at me then, eyes briefly soft, unguarded, and I caught my breath without meaning to. She offered a small smile, fleeting, and suddenly the quiet room felt charged. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I simply stepped back and let her reclaim the space. She straightened, brushing off her jeans, and gave me that brief, unreadable glance. A heartbeat later, she turned away, absorbed in res-tacking receipts or whatever it was she did to keep the world in order. But I couldn't stop thinking about that small, fleeting smile, the gentle tilt of her shoulder as she exhaled, the tiny vulnerability she'd allowed me to witness without a word. And somehow, in that quiet, mundane moment, the air between us felt like it was holding its own secret, one that neither of us dared to name yet. The rain had started sometime after 6, rattling against the wide windows of the shop. It smelled of wet asphalt and damp paper, a sharp contrast to the warm, dim glow of the overhead lights. She was sitting on the floor, knees drawn up, sorting through a pile of returns, and I couldn't help but notice how the light caught the soft curve of her jaw. I never realized how many of these came back, she said, voice low, almost conversational, though I sensed the fatigue beneath it. She looked up at me, eyes briefly meeting mine, and I felt a tight pull in my chest. That same electric tug I couldn't name, but couldn't ignore either. I knelt down beside her, pretending to help organize the stack. My hand brushed hers once, lightly, and she didn't flinch. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade, leaving just us in the quiet hum of the shop. I wanted to say something, anything, that would bridge the distance between us, but my tongue felt heavy. "You're quiet tonight," she said finally, a hint of teasing in her voice, but not enough to mask the edge of tiredness. "Just listening," I muttered, though it sounded weak even to me. There was a pause. She exhaled softly, tilting her head slightly. I caught the faintest tremor in her fingers as she picked up a paperback, flipping it over and over in her hands. The vulnerability was brief, but enough to make my chest ache. I wanted to reach out, to steady her, but some invisible line held me back. Then her phone buzzed. A name I didn't recognize flashed on the screen. She glanced at it, lips tightening, and I saw the briefest shadow cross her face. Irritation, maybe, or worry. She ignored it, slipping the device back into her bag, but the moment shattered the fragile closeness we'd built in silence. I tried to focus on the books, stacking them carefully, but every time I looked at her, my mind betrayed me. The way her hair fell across her cheek, the subtle crease near her brow, the quiet sigh she let out when she thought I wasn't watching. I wanted to lean in, to say something, anything, but the storm outside and the buzzing phone reminded me we weren't alone in the world. A sudden knock on the door startled both of us. The evening delivery had arrived, and she cursed under her breath, standing abruptly. Our hands brushed again, longer this time, and I felt a heat spread through my shoulders. She looked at me, eyes wide for a fraction of a second, lips parting like she might say something, but she didn't. I wanted to reach for her then, to close that tiny distance, to tell her everything I was feeling, but the knock echoed in my ears like a warning. She was her own person, cautious, layered, and I wasn't sure I had the right to cross that line. Instead, I let her move past me, heart pounding, fingers twitching as if still holding on to a fragment of contact. And I stayed kneeling on the floor, staring at the rain streaking down the window, thinking about the warmth of her hand, the way her eyes lingered just a moment too long, and how close, almost unbearably close, we had been. The shop was empty, the storm finally dying down outside, leaving a damp hush in the air. We were stacked with returns, receipts, and the quiet hum of the radiator, but none of it seemed to matter. She was leaning against the counter, arms crossed loosely, eyes tracing the edges of the books I'd just sorted. I could feel her presence, heavy and deliberate, like it pressed against my skin without touching. "Do you ever wonder if this is too much?" she asked suddenly, voice soft but carrying a weight that made my chest ache. I froze, caught off guard. "Too much," I whispered, unsure if I was allowed to answer. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I mean us. This, whatever this is. We can't pretend it's normal anymore, can we?" She looked at me then, really looked, and I felt exposed under the intensity of her gaze. It wasn't judgment. Not exactly. It was curiosity, hesitation, something like fear wrapped in honesty. I wanted to speak, to say that I didn't care about normal, about rules, about the difference in our worlds. But the words wouldn't come. I could only nod slowly, aware of the tension spiraling between us, silent but impossible to ignore. She leaned back, resting her hands on the counter, and I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers, the faintest shadow of vulnerability in the way she exhaled. Her usual composure, that calm authority I admired, was slipping just enough to make her human, fragile, and achingly present. "Sometimes I feel like I'm dangling," she admitted finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm holding onto something I can't name. And maybe it's you." She shook her head quickly, as if trying to erase the admission. "No, that's ridiculous." I swallowed hard, heart hammering. "It doesn't sound ridiculous," I said, the words trembling out before I could stop them. "I feel it too. Every time I see you, every time." I trailed off, unsure how to finish without breaking some invisible boundary. She didn't answer. She just looked at me, eyes wide, searching, maybe for reassurance, maybe for permission to speak more. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and I realized we weren't just standing in a shop filled with books. We were standing on the edge of something neither of us had a map for. I wanted to reach for her hand, to bridge the gap that had suddenly become unbearably apparent. But I stayed where I was, hands tucked awkwardly at my sides, letting her set the pace. Finally, she spoke again, a little more firm, but still raw. "I don't want this to break me," she said. Her voice cracked slightly, and I felt something shift in my chest, a tight, sharp ache I couldn't ignore. "I don't even know if I can handle what I'm feeling. And yet, I can't stop noticing you. Not even for a second." Her words hung in the air, unfinished, almost unbearable. I wanted to tell her everything I was thinking, everything I wanted to do. But the honesty between us was terrifying, and so I stayed quiet, letting the moment linger, fragile and trembling. She turned away, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for a second I thought she might run from the room. Instead, she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Maybe I'm too late to stop it." I was shelving a stack of old magazines when she called my name softly. I turned, and she was holding a small, worn photo, edges curled, faded like the memory it carried. She didn't smile, didn't laugh. She just held it, as if it weighed more than the paper it was printed on. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly, almost to herself. Her voice carried a fragility I'd never heard before, like the walls she kept so carefully built were trembling just enough to let a crack of light in. I moved closer, careful not to startle her. "Who is it?" I asked, though I already had an idea from the way her lips tightened and her eyes softened. Her gaze drifted to the photo, then back to me. Someone I loved and lost, she admitted, voice low and even, like she'd rehearsed the words 1,000 times. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned the photo over, and I noticed the faint crease of worry between her brows. I didn't know, I said softly. My heart constricted at the vulnerability she was letting me see, the part of herself she rarely revealed. She shook her head, biting her lip. You don't. I've carried it with me. All these years. Her laugh was almost bitter, a sound that seemed to start and stop before it reached my ears. And yet, somehow, here I am, noticing you. Noticing things I shouldn't, things I promised myself I'd ignore. I swallowed, unsure what to say. All I could do was reach out, gently, letting my hand hover near hers. She didn't move away. Her fingers brushed against mine accidentally, and it was enough to send a tiny current through me. Not shocking, not dramatic, just quietly seismic. I think, maybe it's because you remind me of him, she admitted, eyes meeting mine briefly. There was a flicker of shame there, or maybe fear, and I didn't look away. Instead, I let her words hang between us, heavy with the kind of intimacy that didn't need more explanation. I'm not him, I whispered, voice uneven. But I notice you. I notice everything. Her shoulders sagged slightly, like she'd been holding her breath for decades. She exhaled, long and trembling, and for a moment, the shop seemed impossibly still. The hum of the radiator, the soft patter of leftover rain outside, even the faint smell of old books, it all faded around us, leaving just the fragile pulse of two people who had no right to feel this close. I never thought I'd let myself care about someone again, she said finally. Her voice cracked, barely audible. She looked down at the photo one last time, pressing it gently against her chest. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed it on the counter between us, as if leaving the past behind but not erasing it. I wanted to reach across and take it from her, to hold her hand and say it would be okay, but I didn't. Instead, I just watched her, breathing shallow, heart pounding. She looked up then, eyes glimmering with something raw and unspoken, and for a fleeting second, the air between us felt like it could fracture, or maybe ignite. And then she whispered, almost to herself, maybe this time, it could be different. The shop was quiet, later than usual. A soft haze of afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. We were both sitting on the floor, backs against the shelves, surrounded by stacks of books we hadn't gotten to. Neither of us spoke at first. Words felt unnecessary, maybe even dangerous. I glanced at her, really looked this time. The fatigue in her eyes was still there, yes, but so was a subtle ease, a softness that hadn't been visible before. Her hair had loosened, falling over her shoulders in gentle waves, and she was watching me with an intensity one could no longer deny. Not because it was sudden, but because I'd been noticing it for weeks without admitting it. You know, she said quietly, finally breaking the silence. This, whatever this is, I can't ignore it anymore, and I don't think I want to. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I shifted slightly, careful not to startle her, and our knees brushed. Her eyes flicked down at the contact, then back to mine. There was no rush, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement, a small bridge between us that we had both been circling for so long. I've been trying, she continued, voice low, almost vulnerable, trying to stay rational, to stay separate. She sighed softly. But it's impossible. Not with you here. Not like this. I felt the tight knot in my chest loosen slightly. No declarations. No promises. Just truth laid bare in the shared stillness. I wanted to reach for her hand, but I waited, letting her set the pace. She leaned slightly toward me, and for a moment, the distance between us collapsed entirely. When our fingers finally touched, it was slow, tentative, like both of us testing if the other could hold this weight. Her hand fit perfectly in mine, not small, not delicate, just exactly right. We didn't squeeze, didn't pull. We just stayed like that, letting the warmth spread quietly, gently, between us. She tilted her head, brushing her forehead against mine in a subtle, effortless gesture. I closed my eyes, feeling the unspoken understanding pass between us, the acknowledgement of weeks of hesitation, stolen glances, quiet moments, and the small, impossible intensity that had grown between us. No one else needed to know. No grand gestures, no proclamations. Just this, the quiet certainty of proximity, the knowledge that we had chosen to share this space, this moment, without needing to define it beyond what it already was. The hum of the radiator, the faint smell of old paper, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. It all became a part of the moment, grounding it in reality. I let my hand rest against hers, fingertips brushing, and felt a soft exhale escape her lips. The storm of tension, longing, and unspoken words that had been building between us finally eased. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, the silence comfortable, not empty. I realized, then, that this quiet collapse into mutual understanding was more profound than any words could capture. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the floor, I knew we didn't need more. We just had this, and for now it was enough. Looking back now, it feels almost impossible that it all began in a quiet bookstore, with her teasing me to behave, while her sister smirked from the counter. At the time, I thought I was just fumbling through days, stacking books, pretending I knew what I was doing. I had no idea how much that one glance, that small shared pause, could ripple through my life. She's different now, though she never really changed. Confident, composed, a little guarded, but softer around me, in ways I can't put into words. I've changed too. I notice details I used to miss. The way her fingers brush against paper, the subtle inflection in her laughter, the weight of her exhalations. I've learned that love isn't always fireworks or declarations. Sometimes, it's leaning into someone's quiet presence, holding their hand without saying a word, and understanding that your hearts have quietly found each other. We learned things the hard way: how to navigate unspoken rules, how to respect distance without losing intimacy, how to let moments of vulnerability be exactly that: fragile, untamed, and entirely human. There were nights when I left the shop feeling hollow, haunted by what-ifs, and there were mornings when she let me catch her smile before she returned to the world outside. Each moment carried weight, each pause a conversation of its own. I remember the stormy nights, the shared silences, the times we almost confessed and didn't, and I realize now that those near misses were never failures. They were the proof that we were paying attention to the right things, the subtleties, the hesitations, the tiny threads that tie two people together in ways words alone can't describe. Being with her isn't perfect. It's not supposed to be, but it's ours. There's a rhythm to it now. Quiet mornings filled with coffee and lingering glances, evenings spent with hands brushing over shared books, and the rare, unspoken acknowledgement of everything we've survived to get here. There's comfort in the unpredictability, in the tension that once made my chest ache and now makes it feel alive. And when I think about that first day, the way she said behave with just the right edge of mischief, I smile. Because it wasn't just a joke or a moment. It was the spark that led us here, to this quiet, unshakable understanding, where love doesn't need to scream to be real. So here we are, still learning each other, still discovering what it means to be both human and unguarded, and still holding on to those tiny, electric moments that make the rest of the world fade away. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?